Beginning in 1821, men and women throughout the United States were engrossed with the unfolding revolution between the Greeks and the Ottoman Turks. Known as Philhellenes, early Americans articulated sentiments through a perceived cultural, intellectual, religious, and even racial connection they felt to Greece. As it became clear by the late 1820s, the Greeks would indeed achieve independence. Philhellenes and education reformers doubled down in their interest to provide aid to Greece, focusing on the building of schools. The United States government, through the presence of its first consul in Greece, also supported this effort through diplomacy, as well as providing protection for American missionaries and educators residing there. The redemption of the Greeks by various pro-Greek organizers assumed a secularized missionary spirit, which endeavored to spread an American understanding of freedom, liberty, and Christianity to all parts of the world. Both American and European Philhellenes held that the modern Greeks had been living so long under Ottoman rule that they required assistance in returning their society to what they imagined it was in Greece's classical age. If the modern Greeks could overthrow Ottoman tyranny and establish a free society, then perhaps the once great Greek civilization could reemerge. The Philhellenic interest in, quote unquote, saving the Greeks did not stem exclusively from the fact that the Greeks were Christian. In fact, many Europeans and Americans viewed the Orthodox Greeks as the wrong kind of Christians. Instead, they held a romantic hope that ancient Greece could somehow be revived through their intercession. It was widely held that the Greeks could not obtain freedom without assistance, a belief that fueled a sense of urgency behind the movement. Americans living in the Mediterranean were familiar with Ottoman laws and social standards as they had operated under them for decades. Although early Americans often perceived Ottoman Turks and Islam as being authoritarian and entirely contradictory to the freedom they thought the United States guaranteed, missionary work prior to Greek independence was made possible by the religiously tolerant Ottoman government. If Christian missionaries did not interfere with the operations of the Ottoman government, they were able to move freely, distributing Bibles and other religiously educational literature. American missionaries and reformers expected that their efforts for building schools in a newly independent Greece would be more welcome than they had been when Greece was under Ottoman rule. Education reformers expected that by educating the Greeks, they were potentially building up an ability to extend their missionary and reformist perspectives into the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Samuel Gridley Howe, a well-known American Philhellene and veteran of the Greek Revolution, sums this sentiment up best. Quote, "If we would restore Greece to her ancient glory, if we would give her commercial importance, if we would erect on the outposts of Christendom lighthouses and beacons to guide the missionary and the teacher in the pagan East, we must elevate the moral and intellectual standards of the Greeks. We must make of them the pioneers of religion and civilization to Asia." Efforts made by American diplomats and reformers in the early years of Greek nationhood to establish schools in Greece suggest that the United States made clear efforts at not only providing support to the Greek state, but also endeavored to influence it to advance U.S. interests. For the Greeks, their sense of identity as a newly independent nation stemmed not only from the influence of the Greek Enlightenment intellectuals who had inspired the origins of the Greek Revolution, but also Orthodox Christianity. Built upon the romanticized notions of Greece's ancient history, combined with the prevalence of the Orthodox faith among those of Greek descent, Greek revolutionaries articulated a sense of Greek identity as needing to come out from the subservience to a foreign and heretical ruler. Through independence, the Greeks no longer perceived themselves as Christian Rhea, or subjects under Muslim rule, but rather as Hellenes, a group of people with shared language, history, and religion. Determined to impart their own religious identities in a newly independent Greece, American education reformers would fail to understand the importance of orthodoxy within Greek identity. Samuel Gridley Howe's efforts to influence a newly independent Greece were perhaps the most visionary of the other American reformers. After spending years fighting for Greek independence and lobbying Americans for financial support for the cause, Howe turned his attention toward the establishment of a colony for Greek refugees, which he named Washingtonia. First negotiating with local officials in 1829 for a piece of land, Howe began to lay the groundwork for his colony near the Isthmus of Corinth. That summer, he selected 26 families from several war-torn areas of Greece, then under Ottoman occupation, and transported them to Washingtonia. Howe made agreements with the families, providing seed, cattle, tools, and rations, all financially supported by American Philhellenes. Although Howe and his colonists were focused initially on planting and harvesting, Howe also wrote in his journal in June 1829 that one of my first cares was the establishment of a school. The schoolhouse sustained Howe's efforts, developing the colony, writing that little school is my favorite resort, finding that in the bright countenances of the students, the certain indications of the future character of the race. Interestingly, the building Howe selected for the school was the country house of the former Pasha of Corinth. The Pasha Howe is referring to in his journal is Mahmud Pasha of Larissa, nicknamed Dramali Pasha, who had been the governor of Larissa, Drama, and Morea before the outbreak of the Greek Revolution. Repurposing the Pasha's house as a school for Greeks was not only practical, but also a visible transition from Ottoman rule to Greek. Howe wrote that he planned for the school to eventually be large enough for at least 200 scholars. This was an ambitious goal, given the total population of Washingtonia in the summer of 1829 had increased to about 200 souls. When Howe left Greece in June 1830, he put his friend and fellow Philhellene/education reformer, George Finlay, in a leadership role over the colony. Howe was not the only American interested in uplifting the Greek population through education. Dr. Jonas King, a Congregationalist Protestant American missionary and educator, and John Henry Hill, an Episcopal minister, and his wife Frances, endeavored to establish schools in Greece. King's initial purpose was to provide humanitarian aid to Greek civilians displaced by the Ottomans during the Greek Revolution. After the war was over, King remained in Greece as a representative of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or abbreviated ABCFM. King's purpose for remaining in Greece was more clearly slated toward conversions, while the Hills were perhaps more focused on providing education in line with Greek interests. Historian Angelo Rapusis argued that many Greeks viewed King as an obnoxious representative from a young nation who thought he could teach a much older culture something about Christianity, and whose stated goals for evangelism were illegal under Greek law. Rapusis explained that while religious toleration was observed in Greece, this was meant for private worship for foreigners, not proselytism to the Greek population. He argued that if King had confined his work exclusively to the intellectual and moral education of the Greek students, the inhabitants might have tolerated him. In 1851, however, King, then residing in Athens, found himself charged with proselytism and was found guilty in an Athenian criminal court. The ABCFM pressured the US government to intervene on King's behalf. Secretary of State Daniel Webster not only sent a special agent to Greece to investigate, but also the US Mediterranean Squadron, whose purpose was to protect American merchants and their commercial interests from foreign powers and marauding pirates, was also sent. Rapusis connects this incident with the expansion of US protection for Americans, regardless of profession, overseas, along with American confidence in their ability to change the world. When it became clear that the Greek government would not tolerate American proselytism in their schools, the ABCFM abandoned educational work in Greece. King, however, remained in Athens until his death in 1869, circulating school books and religious tracts. John Hill and his wife faced similar investigations in 1842. According to the Spirit of Missions, a missionary report for the Protestant Episcopal Mission, the Hills were specially accused of proselyting the young to a foreign religion, which brought about an investigation into the Hill School by the Synod of the Greek Church and the Greek government. That the Greek government became involved in the investigation also suggests there were concerns among the Greeks that their sense of national identity was being undermined by foreign-led schools. For most of these American-based schools established in Greece, they would not survive beyond the mid-19th century. The Hill School is, interestingly, the exception. The Hills remained in Athens, running their school for younger children until their deaths in the 1880s. The Hill School still exists today in Athens as an elementary school. One figure who perhaps best encapsulates the goals American education reformers had for Greece was the Greek refugee Gregory Perticaris. Born around 1804 in Macedonia, then under Ottoman rule, Perticaris and his family suffered greatly during the Greek Revolution. His mother, 2 brothers, and 4 sisters were all captured by Ottoman soldiers and enslaved. Perticaris eventually met Reverend Jonas King and missionary Pliny Fisk, who helped to arrange for his travel to the United States to receive an education. The Connecticut Current reported in 1826, when Perticaris arrived in Boston, that he demonstrated great promise and was in every way worthy of Greece in her better days. The article continued that the influence which these young men will exert on returning to their native land, it is delightful to contemplate, indicating the hope in educating Greek refugees, such as Perticaris, and there were many in addition to Perticaris, by the way, was thought to be a good investment if they would return to Greece and help to educate the rest of the population. Perticaris later made a name for himself as a lecturer, speaking especially about the intellectual, moral, and prospective condition of modern Greece. Eventually, Perticaris caught the attention of the Van Buren administration and was asked to serve as the first United States consul to Athens. He arrived in Athens in January of 1838. Perticaris is an interesting figure, given that he was born in the Ottoman Empire, identified as Greek, but had been educated in the United States, residing there during some of the most formidable years of youth and young adulthood. Perticaris's correspondence with the U.S. Department of State, as well as his own writings, suggest a dichotomy of thought and a greater complexity than issues over religious teaching. Where Angelo Repusis argued that the primary issues surrounding American schools in Greece rested on differences of religion, Perticaris's writings suggest that while religion was certainly a major issue of contention between Americans in Greece and the local population, local Greek politics and competing conceptions of Greek nationalism also played a role in how Perticaris carried out his duties as consul. Writing to Secretary of State John Forsyth on October 7th, 1839, Perticaris reported that, quote, religious and party considerations have had a tendency to prejudice the minds of the people and call out a strong opposition to the American missionaries. This opposition has its origins in Russian influence, which is exercised on the ignorant and bigoted part of the community, thus rendering it the more formidable. Included in this letter to Forsyth was correspondence Perticaris had received from Greek Minister of Foreign Affairs Konstantinos Zagraphos. In this letter, Zagraphos conveyed that, quote, His Majesty's aide-de-camp, Kalakatrones, has declared before passengers on board a Greek government steamer that he was ready to become the assassin of the Americans, meaning those benevolent individuals who have been and who now are engaged in aiding the cause of education in Greece. Given that Kalakatrones has served in the Greek Revolution and was a noted hero, there was cause for concern that not only did he mean to follow through with this statement, but that his words would be persuasive to others who listened. Zographos conveyed to Perticaris that the king had administered a severe reprimand to Kolokotrones, but had not dismissed him from service, fearing that doing so may upset pro-Russian factions in Athens. Perticaris confided to Forsyth that because the king chose not to dismiss Kolokotrones, he felt it was unclear to what extent the king shared or rejected Kolokotrones' views. In reality, King Otto had consciously appointed to his cabinet members from all three political factions of the time. These were pro-Russia, pro-French, and pro-British factions. Of the three, pro-Russia faction was the most conservative, driven by, quote, Russian propaganda based on common religion, namely Orthodoxy, and the close ties between Greeks and their relatives living in Russia proper. Perticaris recommended that the Mediterranean squadron make more frequent appearances at the port of Piraeus, located not far from Athens. This incident, which centered upon the protection of American citizens specifically involved in providing education in Greece, led to the United States employing gunboat diplomacy against the Greeks to protect education reformers. After Perticaris returned to the United States in 1843, he wrote a book about his reflections on the Greek people, noting multiple times the importance of education for both male and female Greek students, and that the cause of religion, of justice, of letters, and education have hitherto made such progress as to offer the most cheering promises for the future. In his book, The Greece of the Greeks, Perticaris seemed to present a neutral perspective about the ongoing efforts at establishing a reliable system of education in Greece, from the perspective that the Greeks needed to find a system that suited their national interests rather than accept foreign assistance. He does discuss the contributions of Jonas King, noting that his work was, quote, among the most distinguished of the American missionary schools, but he also observed, however, that these schools were never regarded as national institutions, and while there were many of the Greeks who thought them great blessings, the mass of the people with the church at their head looked upon them with suspicion. Perticaris hoped through education that Athens would once more become the abode of those who are devoted to the pursuit of letters and science, and who, we doubt not, are destined to complete the unfinished mission of the ancient Greeks, the civilization of the East. While Perticaris seemed to have backed away from advancing the notion that the United States had to be involved in this process in order to be successful, he still expressed the hope that Greece might eventually serve as some sort of gateway of civilization to the East through the success of their education system. Early American missionaries and reformers believed their best chance at influencing change in the East was through a newly independent Greece as its gateway. This assumption proved to be wrong. Given the Ottoman Empire's tolerance for missionaries and their schools, American-run schools were far more successful in the Ottoman Empire in the years that followed the Greek Revolution. The ABCFM, for example, expanded their presence in Western Asia over the course of the 19th century, eventually establishing, by 1895, 14 main stations, 268 outstations, 46 missionaries, 63 lady missionaries, 117 catechists, 11,835 full members, 32,092 adult, and 24,132 child students in the Sunday schools. This growth in the ABCFM missionary presence indicates a steadily increasing influence in the Ottoman Empire, with schools in particular undermining Ottoman legitimacy. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.